So a couple years ago, I distinctly remember this incident taking place at a Sesame Place, wherein a costume character ignored a couple of little black girls, and it was a rough time. A lot of stories emerged suggesting that this was a systemic issue with this brand of park, which is fucked up in and of itself. I had many questions. And in response, I had recorded this whole thing, detailing and documenting my feelings on Sesame Street and how far it had fallen, that I just ended up not using. Now, it's been probably 2 or 3 years since that incident has taken place, so a fair amount of the stuff that I'd put in for that was out of date. So I wanted to try my hand at just recording it fresh, because the idea itself is still perennial, you know? There's a decent chance that whenever this drops, there's another controversy that'll emerge based off of poor decision making or whatever that'll make this relevant again. Frankly, I just have mixed feelings on this entity in general, because while it has done an incredible good for the American public, there have been many decisions made that, honestly, I think calls into question the fidelity of the entire project. I don't really know where to begin. I guess it makes sense to start with the Big Bang. I'm kidding. Sesame Street was created about 2 or 3 years before it was launched. Most people know by now that it was a huge undertaking in research and funding. By that point, it was like the mid-60s. People were still unconvinced that TV could be anything more than just jingling keys. They didn't know that the TV could actually teach you things, let alone be able to educate a whole generation of children. But the folks at the very top, the ones that came up with the idea, had a hypothesis that actually was the case. And they had a catalyst to actually explore this with a demographic that could use a boost. See, they had dug up studies that had indicated that black and brown kids were entering into the school system with a disadvantage, maybe like a year's gap in education compared to their white peers, and unfortunately, over time, that gap would never really close, it would just get bigger and bigger. Children were being theoretically left behind in droves due to socioeconomical issues, various environmental factors, and this was a demographic that had yet to truly be assisted. So this was a decent starting point for them, right? More commonly, especially during the incident that I referenced earlier, there were a lot of think pieces that came out dissecting how Sesame Street was our black generation's first show, and it was this, it was that, it did all this stuff. Some of you might have got it. For some of you, it might have been the first you've ever heard of this, but it is probably the first time that I think it's been so widely discussed, which is cool, but it also kind of sets a precedent. So the show itself took ages and ages to develop, let alone be able to fully fund and everything. The show is actually older than the genesis of the public broadcasting service. I don't know if you knew that. It's got like probably a few months on it at least. PBS is of course publicly funded, but the amount that the government designates for PBS is pretty small. There are other streams of revenue that help keep it afloat, but it's a non-insignificant chunk of money. And out of that chunk of money, Sesame Street receives a little paltry sum of that. So from the very beginning, the show was funded by a whole slew of sources. And when the show became a smash success, the doors had flung wide open to the possibility of creating a fuck ton of merch. This created a bit of a conflict of interest. Sesame Street is wholly dedicated to educating, nurturing these spirits, but during commercials it's also hawking the lunchboxes and the plushes and the everything. Overwhelming. Especially during this period of time in the 70s where we're starting to clamp down on what we consider inappropriate content for children. Stuff that was too violent, too commercialized, too unfriendly even. This is a tightrope that Big Bird has been forced to walk the entire time. From the very beginning, the higher-ups involved were vigilant in their search to find proper sponsors and things like that. Rarely, if ever, have they used their power for evil, shall we put it. There haven't been many occasions where the actual product being hawked would raise eyebrows. It's more just about the principle of the thing. It was kind of funny too, because Sesame Street had a habit of chucking anything that could be vaguely detrimental or harmful to kids. They didn't really care about the context or anything like that. There's plenty of stuff that's fallen by the wayside, maybe even become lost media, squarely because a few people complained and were like, oh shit, this might actually be harmful, we don't want to do that. Honestly, the story of Roosevelt Franklin in its entirety is a perfect encapsulation of this microcosm at play. You have a homegrown character who adds more diverse elements to the show that kids love, they get invested in, and they actively learn from. One that is homegrown directly from one of the core creatives on board, and within like a couple years is just snuffed out entirely. Because a few old farts in academia were like, well, I mean, you know, you probably shouldn't be doing this. I mean, it's perpetuating some stereotypes, so I don't know. I think there's a deep irony to a pack of black intellectuals putting a stop to this character who is whip smart, forthright, patient, understanding, manages minding his own business, he's doing his own shit, and because he and his classroom are a little lively, a little too energetic, they had to put a stop to that shit. This is an extenuating factor, and it is a thread that is probably going to follow Sesame Street to its bitter end, whenever that may come. But point being, there was a constant push and pull present. The show itself had to keep pushing boundaries in order to find new sources of revenue, while at the same time making sure that they fell in line with their own standards. Luckily, this show was pretty successful. They could get a lot of shit off. If Follow That Bird wasn't up against all of these fucking films, it could have been movie of the year. We could have had the Scooby-Doo model. We get a new Sesame Street film every year or two. It makes a little chunk of change and it funds the show or something like that. Even something closer to Elmo and Grouchland would be acceptable. It was a decent flick. So they found all manner of streams to follow up until, I would say, like the early 90s. Things were relatively smooth. I mean, after Jib's passing, everyone was a bit lost, a bit aimless. But it was rather serendipitous that a lot of these changes started to converge after he died. Sesame Street had a very comfortable place within PBS and within kids' programming in general. Not like it didn't have its competition, but, you know, it was very secure in its spot. Until somebody came along and flipped all of that shit on its head. And you would never guess who it would be. Come on, I want you to throw them out right now. Come on. You're wrong. I'm gonna tell you right now. Whoever you're thinking of, automatic L. So this guy literally ruined this streak. I know you weren't expecting this news right now, but you deserve to know the truth. I would say by the early 90s, Sesame Street was almost becoming a victim of its own success. It had encouraged a whole slew of educational programs to come and go, to tackle all types of subjects, math, science, reading, writing. There was plenty of time that people had to mold and refine these concepts in education and in entertainment. So by the time this big lunk came along, the landscape was vastly changing. He took such a big chunk out of their ratings, they were getting scared. They were getting a little concerned here.
PBS at the time, their programming was, children's programming was for anybody under the age of 12. Now you know that the difference between a 3-year-old and a 6 or 7-year-old is light years, much less you get up to 12. And so we were very firmly locked into that. This is a preschool thing. And I think that's one of the things that made it work really well.
In order to compete for their viewers, they had to kick a few of them to the curb on the older end and appeal to the smallest group possible. They had terraformed the set to include this whole other universe, this whole other part of the street, to make the world feel more full and inclusive and colorful. Dramatic ass shift, right? Imagine like spending X amount of time, you know, each intro is pretty much the same. These are just kids walking around in a neighborhood that looks like yours, and they're singing that song. You know that song by heart. It sounds the same every time, and it's comfortable. But then one day, they start doing it a little bit different. What the hell is all this? You see this? Look at this. Oh my god. All these changes do not come cheap. Predictably so, there was a lot of time and money invested in making Sesame Street more palatable to this. Is it even a preschool audience anymore? It might be sub-preschool now. Now, it wasn't a complete loss, of course. You know, by this point, Elmo was already a superstar. They could already capitalize on him as much as they liked. Several gambles with Elmo paid off in spades. You already know about Tickle Me Elmo. Nothing was ever the same past that Christmas. You have that Elmo-palooza album sitting on your shelf somewhere. You were also there for the start of Elmo's World. All of that boosted the show's profile. So things were definitely different, but they weren't a lost cause, I guess. Transitioning into the new millennium was kind of tough, because as the decade wore on, there were just more and more real titans coming up to try and replace it, right? It wasn't just Barney. It was Arthur. It was fucking Blue's Clues. So many ops out here for the street. It's wild. Now already, by the time you get up to this point, there's a lot of old heads associated with the show that are falling off. You know, they're retired. Maybe they're dying off. Maybe they're just disgruntled with the way things have changed so rapidly. The whole format of the show is changing. What made it revolutionary in 69 is now making it passé in 99. And they are forced to make the show more palatable for younger viewers. And that includes changing how they tell their stories. Throughout the 2000s, you know, things keep chugging along, more or less the same as they were before. If you were still watching the show on PBS, you've probably seen a few underwriting credits, right? You know, it's like before the show begins and after it ends, they gotta tell you who made it possible. And they had a bunch of sponsors that I don't think they would have picked up 10, 15, 20 years prior. That in and of itself was considered a bit controversial. If memory serves, they were already in a tighter position than they were in the 90s. By the time Abby came along, they were already on the cusp of cutting jobs, maybe pulling back on certain initiatives and things. A few years after that, the literal street is revamped, and it looks at least a little different than how it did before. Quite literally, they have gentrified the street set. Look at this! Look at it, really. Look at this shit. There's a deep irony to it all, right? The reason why it takes place on an urban street, a dirty, grungy-looking alley full of all types of creatures and faces, is because it was mirroring the environment of the audience it was supposed to appeal to. And though the show was still indebted to them, this is still their target audience, we also kind of have to fan out and make the investors happy too, you know? There's some about them grump storylines that they weren't telling us about. I think something happened behind the scenes. So they kept chugging along, they kept hitting milestones and shit. Honestly, I think the last 15 years or so is where there were cracks that were starting to show, or at least people became more cognizant of them. Finally launched a initiative on autism around 2017. They have a new autistic Muppet on the street. They use her a lot. Not necessarily a token character, which is cool. It would be cooler if Autism Speaks wasn't involved. Reason being, historically speaking, this organization has always had a focus on perhaps curing autism, not approaching this sort of from a pragmatic perspective. They get a little eugenicsy, you know? Just a little bit. And so naturally this would be rather controversial choice for an advisor. Now, of course, there were other organizations that were on board with this project, but at a certain point, they did find the presence of Autism Speaks to be suffocating. And when they went to talk with the producing bodies, it doesn't seem like their concerns were heard, because at a certain point, Autism Speaks becomes the only main advocacy group involved in shaping this initiative. So, not the greatest. Could have done a bit better. Sesame Street has been trying to maintain a diverse environment pretty much since, like, season 1. There were certain groups that had complained at certain times, and whenever they did, they would add a new character into the mix. Sometimes when they added characters of their own accord, it wouldn't exactly pan out, and they wouldn't necessarily stick with them forever. If you compared the cast from 20, 30 years before against the one from today, you would probably notice that it's not necessarily homogenized, but it's definitely condensed. By the 2010s, they're already engaging in the idea of cutting the show in half. It's traditionally always been an hour long up until recently when they had cut down episodes into half-hour chunks. This was largely seen as a byproduct of the legendary HBO deal. Of course, bankroll new episodes of the show. They would get first-run rights to the show, and those peons that were still stuck watching PBS would have to wait a whole 9 months to get their new episodes. In certain cases, like the COVID special or the racism special, they would simulcast it. Otherwise, you're waiting a whole school year to get your fix of New Sesame Street. And to get less of it, by the way. Not the most popular choice. It's a very difficult decision to grapple with, because anyone who probably wasn't watching Nickelodeon on cable probably also isn't firing up the HBO Max subscription to watch TV. You know, they probably couldn't afford it. Objectively, it does shrink the radius of accessibility. When it came time for the HBO Max purges, they got rid of all the shows that, in Zaslav's words, were not helping. They didn't get rid of anything that was helping them, in their words, which of course includes like 80% of Sesame Street. The vast majority of the show, probably up to season, I want to say 35, 40, was out. A few early episodes remain, but that is a large chunk of the show that is just not available for public consumption. Also, there was a talk show that they made that also got Thanos snapped. I don't understand why. Like, I guess you just don't know how to money. Like, the fuck is this? So those decisions all hang over the show's head like a giant albatross, even if they're not decisions that were personally made by the people in charge. It's like little things that end up making a big impact, like how they ended up condensing the Muppet cast. More commonly, the 3 Muppets that you are always going to see in some type of episode is Elmo, Cookie Monster, and or Abby. The other ones are kind of auxiliary. You keep a few around just for the legacy. Big Bird, Oscar, Bert, Ernie, Rosita. That sounds ridiculous, but it's true, it's true. It's a bizarre trio to string together, but this is the one that is holding the core of the show to its promise. I still maintain notes from when I reviewed all them PBS cartoons. And I had ended up watching some new Sesame Street just to try and figure this video out too. And they do so much now. Alan is the only one left out of people from my childhood. There's a few new humans and everything. I mean, they're alright. They're kind of bland. They seem like proxies of old characters that had sprung up from before. Now they got like different colored Muppets, right? They got a couple of black Muppets there. I think they have a Korean American one. It was an interesting choice to make. Historically speaking, the kids on the street were always regular kids, you know? They weren't polished actors or anything. They didn't come just off of Broadway. They were, I guess, fresh talent. But whatever time they spent on set, there was time that was spent bolstering interactions that Muppets were having amongst themselves. You know, they were part of the ensemble. That was the whole point. Now we got these kids that are actually, like, acting. You know, they're portraying scenes. They're not living on the street. This is a role that they step into for a little bit. Elmo bookends a lot of segments too. There's more repetitive elements present, and it's been common dogma in preschool for a while that repetition is what sells, so that's more of an industry thing. By the way, he has a dog now. Did you know that? This kid has a fucking dog. I don't know where the dog came from. Well, they made like a cartoon about how he found the dog and they were gonna bring it to a adoption fair, and then he just decided to keep the dog. Like, I'm gonna ignore the fact that you're ignoring that Elmo already has a prized and respected pet of his own. But like, what is the purpose of the dog? Like, what is the dog teaching? The shorts that were conceived around Elmo and the dog are about them like just figuring shit out. It's like Peep in the Big Wide World, except it's not that and it's not as good. I don't understand why this dog, like, why is the dog here? There's a lot of little changes that they had made over the years, and I can't really be mad, I'm just confused. There's a lot of little gaps in knowledge that probably could be filled in, and even if they were, it'd still be like, okay, I understand why you did it, but I don't really understand why you did it. Shit's complicated, you know, I don't really feel like I can fully write it off. But at the same time, it very much feels like the show has lost some sense of focus. It definitely has not really found itself in the ensuing chaos of belonging to HBO and preparing for all of these anniversaries that came up and taking charge of all these co-productions. Like I said, Sesame Street by itself has done very few problematic things in and of themselves. It's just that the current presence of it is flawed, perhaps in the sense that it lacks a core identity. You know, it was never gonna fully be the same as it was in the 80s or even in the 90s, but the identity that they've cultivated in recent years, I think it has a harder and harder time distinguishing itself from other shows of its ilk, which in turn kind of erodes the brand quality that's supposed to be present. It's a very complicated mix. I'm not necessarily unfazed by all of it. It's actually kind of concerning, because in some ways, the street has become more stable, but in others, it makes it harder to predict where it will be in 10, 20, 30 years. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of trapped right now. This show still has a big cultural footprint. Everyone is willing to stand behind it until it's time to give money, but I digress. If we're around the same age, and you probably remember this little stunt from the 2012 election cycle, wherein Mitt Romney stepped up to the podium, there was one instance where he had gotten into his position on public television. Of course, his position was to defund, and he chose to express this in a less palatable fashion, let's say.
I'm sorry, Jim. I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS. I'm going to stop other things. I like PBS. I love Big Bird. I actually like you too. But I'm not going to keep on spending money on things to borrow money from China to pay for. So that's number one.
And he became the media cycle's bitch for the better part of a month. Nobody would let him forget it. You tried to cancel Big Bird? Alright, motherfucker, well... we'll see about that. And then when the man of the hour showed up on national television just to respond, he didn't even have to say a word. He didn't even address the argument. He told a knock-knock joke and then went to bed. It was glorious. This is the type of show that survived decades and decades of turmoil. That was only a decade ago, and I think even that part of the show's soul is in question. It raises a lot of questions about how much they can do and for how long. Yeah, I mean, I don't have any conclusive ending to cap this off. I just kind of wanted to yak about it. Fuck it. I'll just throw in the ending that I already recorded. It works pretty well here. The thing that made Sesame Street so revolutionary is that it was able to take the good and the bad, give you a very realist view of the world, and also just help you navigate it. It's not always sunny days, and that was always the tack that they had followed through on. And I think that they might have lost sight of that. It'd be cool if maybe they could go back to that a bit. Just be a bit more down to earth, a bit more realistic. Because the reality of the street that you're heading towards, it's not going to be the one that you're going to want to stick to.